Welcome to the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and this is the Whitetail Apprentice Series. I'm your host, Josh Luck, and I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Jacob Sklenar. Jacob, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Very happy to be able to hop onto this one. Very excited for it.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day here to hop on. I know you've been pretty busy lately. Yeah. So today's episode is one that I am very excited about. Is with a guest that I have been eager to talk to for quite some time. We are in that exciting time of the year, the rut time frame, when a lot of people are getting really jazzed about being out in the woods and hopefully sticking an arrow in a buck. But one of the things about the rut that I feel like is constantly looked over is doe behaviors during the rut. I feel like bucks get most of the attention. I mean, rightfully so. Everyone wants to shoot a nice buck during the rut, and that's when they primarily feel like they're able to do so. But I feel like as far as a hunting strategy goes, if you want to optimize or maximize your hunting strategy during this time frame, I find it very important to understand what is going on with the doe herd in the area that you are hunting. So in order to help us with this conversation today, our guest is Dr. Steve Ditchkoff. Dr. Ditchkoff, how are you?
Hey, good morning, guys. How you doing?
Doing good.
Great.
Doing good. I can't thank you enough for hopping on here. I know we've talked to multiple different biologists and stuff in this series. I know all of you guys are very, very busy, so I greatly appreciate you hopping on here. I know you've never been on this podcast before, and with any new guest, we usually have them kind of give a brief background of themselves and how they got in the hunting space. And if you could, I'd like to have you go through kind of a brief background of your research, if you don't mind.
Well, I've always been, I started deer hunting, I guess, when I was 18. It was something that I was always interested in doing, didn't have the opportunity so much. I was, grew up in a family that was fishing, so I was outdoors a lot, but didn't really have the opportunity to hunt. And, when I started to be able to hunt at 18, deer hunting, I just was fascinated by it and wanted to go to graduate school and work with large mammals. I wanted to work with deer. And I was fortunate enough to go to University of Maine for my master's in the early 90s and study the wintering ecology of deer. I snowshoed 5 to 10 miles a day out there from January through March. It was amazing experience to kind of understand how this deer is surviving in such, harsh, winter climate.
Yeah.
And then, switched gears and from a geographic perspective, did my PhD in the late 90s in Oklahoma and was extremely fortunate to be able to work on what I consider the best population of white-tailed deer in the country that the public can hunt. It's a lottery system, but McAllister Army Ammunition Plant, that population was just tremendous, the quality of those deer. And so I had the opportunity to study that population from a mate selection perspective, antler quality and antler size, and who's mating with who, and how are they moving, and that sort of thing. And that really kind of spawned my interest in this topic that you approached me with, is how do does, how are they factor into this whole breeding exercise, and how do they influence hunting, that sort of thing. And so that's kind of how I got into it, and I've just been fortunate to be able to kind of ride that path that's taken me to 2025 and beyond.
What was that transition like, going from Maine to, you said, Oklahoma, right?
Well, I'm from Michigan originally, and so Southeast Oklahoma, they had difficulty understanding me, and I had difficulty understanding them at first. But it was the transition was, it was great. It was hot. I struggled with the heat. I won't lie with that, but it was a sportsman's paradise. I knew nothing about Oklahoma, but I'm going from a northern environment where you could hunt deer for 2 weeks, and that was during duck season and during bird season, pheasant, and all at the same time, to seasons spread out through the year, and it was just like, wow, there's stuff you can hunt or you can fish at times of the year that you just can't up north. So to me, 25, 26, 28 years old, wanting to go out and catch and chase everything, it was an amazing opportunity. And then to work at the McAllister Army Ammunition Plant with the people I did was just, I was very fortunate.
Yeah, Oklahoma is a state that interests me quite a bit. It's a very diverse state. I think we were talking with Dr. Mark Turner earlier in the series, because I think he's in that
He's
state.
at Oklahoma State now. Yes.
Yep. And just the diversity in the state, because you got some hill country in the eastern part, and then you get all the way to the far western part of the state, and it's almost like a Texas type, like you just very flat. And
you forget that it's the, it's more than that. It's the foothills of the Rocky Mountains out in the Panhandle. It's the sagebrush mesquite down in the, not sagebrush, but mesquite down in the southwest part of the state. The middle of the state is the plains with tall grass prairie and short grass prairie, and then you have alligators in the southeast corner of Oklahoma. So the diversity in that state is just amazing.
Yeah, I feel like that would make for a very fun state as far as from like a research perspective, because you have so much diversity within that state. But moving on to kind of what you were talking about as far as the breeding aspect of your research. So when I was looking and doing research for this episode, there were a couple articles I came upon. Both of them you were involved in. One was from 2017, breeding behavior of female white-tailed deer relative to conception, evidence of female mate choice. And then a more recent one that I believe was published earlier this year, phenotypic characteristics of successful parental pairs and white-tailed deer, evidence of non-random mating. So these are two topics that I find intriguing. I have heard other hunters, and Jacob, feel free to interject, because I think you've heard some of the same stuff. So just talking with successful hunters in different areas, I have heard some people talk about in areas with big mature bucks that they don't necessarily have to participate, or now this can be dependent on the buck, obviously, and his what's the word I'm looking for? Jacob, help me out here. His personality. So, right, we know there's a lot of different personality differences and bucks, but I've heard hunters talk about areas in which does seek out the more mature bucks in certain areas, and it's almost like these bucks don't have to really do these large excursions because does are coming to them. I have personally never seen this in the woods, but I have heard multiple people talk about does selecting mature bucks in a particular area. So I just found this very interesting, because I would say the majority of people, it's almost the reverse.
It's, my real interest in this, like I said, started in the late 90s. And I remember having a discussion. It wasn't really a discussion. It was my dissertation defense, and I was being hammered pretty hard by my dissertation committee at the time. And I told them, I said, I think females have a choice. And this was at a time when the general belief was a male goes and selects a female and gets rid of all the other males, and that female doesn't have a choice who she mates with. And I remember getting into a debate with one of my committee members at that time and saying a female has to have a choice. Otherwise, all the theories of sexual selection go out the window. I said, how she exhibits that choice is the question. And so that's when I really started thinking about what these females do to maximize their probability of success from a reproductive perspective. And so if you go back to kind of one of the basic rules that I teach our undergraduates in my class, I said you have to approach wildlife management and wildlife behavior from the perspective that everything that animal does is designed to maximize passing on their genes forward. That is what they are doing, whether that's eating to survive, to be able to breed, whether that be getting the best possible mate so that they have the greatest possible survival of their offspring. And there's multiple other examples of this, but that's the number one objective of every animal that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
If that's true, then every female should be trying to find the best possible mate, the best possible genetics for her offspring. And in this case, we're talking about deer. So what is she looking for? She might be looking for large body size. She might be looking for large antler size, or she might be looking for something else genetically. There's a lot of things we could talk about with that, some things we've explored, some things that others have explored. But if that's true, then it has to demonstrate some level of selection. She has to figure out how to get the best possible mate. It might be the most dominant one. It might be the one with the large antlers, but it might be the one with certain genetic characteristics that complement hers better. There's a lot of folks out there believe it's the immune system that drives this, but she's trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, there is in that article, the 2017 article that I was just talking about. There, you had looked at two different mating strategies: the sit and wait strategy, and then we looked at excursions, which. When I've talked to other hunters, and I'm guilty of this myself, I primarily think of a female, a doe's mating strategy as kind of a sit and wait, right? You're out scouting, whether it be private or public, and you have an idea of where your doe groups are. And I feel like in most hunters' mind, that's where they're at, right? You scout the does to be like, okay, the does are in this area, that's where they're going to be. Therefore, the bucks are going to come through here. They're going to go on the downwind side and check this doe group when one of them come into estrus, right? And that's more of that sit and wait strategy. But that study kind of looked at, it found that there were excursions taking place.
Yeah. So, a lot of the ideas that we've implemented with my research group actually come from the human literature. There's a lot of really fascinating studies out there on humans in terms of how they select mates. Josh, who you find attractive is different than who Jacob finds attractive, is different than who I find attractive. And there's a reason that we find different people attractive and vice versa. So there's been a lot of really neat studies with humans. And so those have kind of really stuck out to me. And I said, boy, how do we investigate this with white-tailed deer? And so we had a unique opportunity in the study that you referenced to do just that. We had a study that was funded by the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. And as part of that, we were taking a look at movements and survival of female white-tailed deer. And then it kind of came to me, I said, my goodness, I said, there's a lot of these animals are going to be harvested by hunters when they're pregnant later in the season, because South Carolina has such a long hunting season, and at least on this property where we were working, the peak of the breeding season is early October, but there was a lot of females being harvested they're still hunting in November and December. Yeah. And so there was an opportunity for us to get our hands on these does that were unharvested does that we had actually radio collared before. So we were radio collaring to study movement patterns, but then if we got our hands on them quickly after they were harvested, we could actually pull any of those that were pregnant. We could pull the fetus, do the measurement, and determine the date of conception, which would be the first time that I'm aware of that anybody was ever able to take a look at movement patterns associated with the date of conception. So what is she doing in those days leading up to the day she conceived or the days following and that sort of thing, which would give us an idea of how did she advertise herself to potential mates, at least spatially. Yeah. We don't know what she's doing. We just know where she is and when she's there, but how is she moving on the landscape? It has implications for hunting. We were looking at it from the perspective of, how is she advertising herself to potential mates?
Yeah. Josh, did you, sorry, I had to step out and sign for a package really quick, but did you touch on at all, like the study that happened in humans that was pertinent to this, essentially, with selecting mates?
I did not. Steve had brought up some studies, not specific ones.
I wanted to hit on like a study that was done just to give people a feel, because we've talked extensively on this podcast about how much more capable a deer's sense of smell is than ours, and it's just to insane factors. But there was a study done in humans where they basically had a bunch of guys work out and get their t-shirts sweaty or their clothes sweaty, and then they put these shirts and clothes into a bag, and they had women come in.
Experiments.
Yeah, and they had women come in and randomly select the t-shirts, and they actually measured their MHC genes, so their major histocompatibility locus genes, which it's like a measure of your ability to combat certain things in a way, combat sicknesses and things like that, expressed through your genes. And the women, without knowing these people and just smelling sweat, which I'm sure wasn't the most pleasant thing that they could ever smell, with an extremely high consistency, selected men that had opposing MHC genes to them, which would make them an ideal mate because their genes could come together and resist the most diseases and things possible and make the healthiest child possible. And so we do that not knowingly even, and it's really interesting because obviously a lot of different factors go into us selecting a mate, and I'm sure the same goes for deer, but it begs the thought process that if deer have a smelling capability in the order of 200 times greater than ours or more, there's your ability to break down scents far greater. Do you think that that's something that they're actively doing as well? And it sounds like you completely agree with that.
Yeah, you're the first person I've ever spoken to that actually knew about the white T-shirt experiments. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing about you, but it says
I love this stuff. I love human anatomy and deer anatomy and all that.
I mean, these studies are from the early 90s, late 90s that they were doing these things, and it's fascinating in terms of, they put pictures of these guys up that you smelled, the ladies smelled the bags. They put pictures of them up. There was actually relatedness between symmetry of the eyes and the face, and just similarity and dissimilarity of the MHC. And actually, the MHC was part of the work I did during my dissertation.
Oh, nice.
Part of the data we studied. And so those are some of the studies I was referencing it, but then there's also some very, very, very neat behavioral stuff where they've looked at exotic dancers and dancers, how their tips peak right around the time they're ovulating. Obviously they are doing something behaviorally on stage that is, that the guys in the audience are sensing somehow, or maybe it's olfactory. I don't know what it is. But there's a lot of really neat studies out there with humans, because you can examine some things very creatively that give insight into what's going on in the animal world, or vice versa. And so, but it's those exact sorts of studies that Jacob brought up that really, have made me think about this in terms of what are these animals doing? A female has to be, if that female doe is trying to pass on the best genes, then she wants the ones that has the largest antlers, that acquires food the best, and all of these things. And we always think it's the most dominant. But is it the most dominant? It might be the one that has the certain MHC genes, the major histocompatibility complex genes, because the immune system, if I can produce one thing, I want a healthy offspring. I want one that is not, that is resistant to ectoparasites. It is resistant to, maybe it's CWD or EHD or whatever those diseases are, that's going to challenge it. Because if I can produce a healthy offspring, that one is probably going to survive. And so, there's something there.
Yeah,
Josh, there's another study that he did that I wanted to kind of rope in if I could. Go right ahead. I have my thoughts saved. Yeah, the study was something along the line of androgens, antlers, and sexual selection, and it was breaking down testosterone's relationship to reproduction. And so in this one, you particularly talk a lot about body size. Testosterone is maybe a factor of dominance, and potentially, and then also antler size. And I don't want to dive too far into the weeds because I know we're going to go even more in depth, but I always have this question when I think about deer and their demeanor, because there are a lot of really quote unquote, there's giant deer, big white tails that are very mature on some of the properties I hunt. We're talking 180 plus inch deer that are far less dominant than a 60-inch buck that's 9 years old and just is a freaking bully. And I've watched him beat the crap out of a 140 class deer before. And so I'm really curious, because I don't know how a deer would have certainty of the antlers on his own head. And I'm curious if the demeanor of the deer you've seen is kind of predisposed by their personality, maybe testosterone levels, maybe age, class, and size. And conversely, is the way that other deer interact with that deer maybe based a lot on outward appearance as well, because then they can factor in antler size and things like that.
I don't know. These are things that I've laid around thinking about at night. The sorts of questions you're asking.
We're similar guys.
Again, you're the first person I've ever. This is something I said for a long time. How does a deer know what its own antlers are? And I've always thought it's during these bachelor groups. You look around and you see who is who's being submissive, who's being dominant to who. It's like, how are other deer being treated by other deer? And you kind of factor your way in. It's no different than you've played card game where you got to put the card up on your forehead and look around and try and bet what you have. It's like a game of that to some degree. And so I don't know. I don't know the answers to those questions. There's a lot of really neat things going on out there, and some of it's too deep into the weeds sometimes to even begin to be able to understand. There's huge deer out there that don't breed very often, and there's other deer, or maybe they breed, but maybe they just don't sire offspring. There's issues with sperm competition. Which one has the sperm that are most competitive? The faster swimmers. We have some data that I'm really not going to get into here that suggests that the egg might have the ability to reject some sperm and maybe accept others.
Wow.
There's a lot of things going on there that are just kind of almost Star Trek-y.
Yeah, that was a large development in humans recently too. It's not necessarily the race mentality that everyone's thought it has been.
Yeah, there's a lot of really wild stuff there. And so, unfortunately, I'm not going to be around long enough to be able to answer some of these questions. I'm going to have to move off to out to pasture. And and so, but I think there's going to be a lot of really neat stuff figured out in the next 10 to 30 years with this that is really cool. But at the same time, you come back to, at the end of the day, I'm just a guy with a gun going out and sitting in a tree trying to say, where can I put myself to increase my probability of success? And all these things factor in and influence it. But how much it's going to help me versus how much it's going to distract me, that becomes the question.
Yeah. I really love two things about this podcast, just right off the rip. I love one that you started it with a frame of essentially that you might not know every factor, but the certain things are going to give us confidence and are going to relate in trend wise. And I really like that. And I love that you answer that question by saying, I don't know, because that's like a true scientist answer. Like that's someone that really is not trying to assign some personal thought process to this, that you're clearly operating off of data and facts. And that's the whole essence of this series is this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to have a good discussion and base it off of as many as we can. And there are plenty of people that have facts and figures and things like that to work off of, but don't necessarily say that they don't have the information to back this theory when someone gets asked a hard question, because they want to make it seem like they know all the answers as much as possible. And so I really appreciate that you are very open with that. But it doesn't mean we can't have meaningful discussion on it. And I really like, I'd say the big thing with the framework of this podcast in particular that I really like is that you said at the beginning that their behavior is an orientation to how can they live and perpetuate their offspring? How can they perpetuate their species? And the more I look into human biology and deer biology and behaviors and everything like that, just the adaptive process of everything, it's so clear that that is the way that so many things operate. Josh, we talked about a few weeks ago, we recorded a podcast about soil quality versus plant life. And we found that plants that lived in very poor soil had the same nutrient density as plants that lived in very good soil, but they would grow shorter and there would be less of them. And that makes so much sense. They're dealing with extreme stress. They're adapting to that stress. And instead of trying to grow to the full length and just die out, they want to perpetuate their species so they grow less of them, but they keep of the same quality so that they continue to live on. And I feel like it's so amazing how throughout plants and humans and animals, how this presence of how can I keep living to the next day and how can I make sure my offspring lives the next day is just everywhere. And I love that that's the foundation that we started with here.
Yeah, that's very interesting stuff. Going back to something that was just mentioned earlier, Jacob, you kind of brought it up as does using their sense of smell, right? Trying to figure out if bucks maybe have like a certain immunity. It's just Ohio is getting hit hard with EHD right now, so it just kind of sparked a thought in my head of like, I wonder what the rut is going to look like now. Like, will individuals see more like excursion type behavior from females because they're looking for, they're selecting mates that may have developed some sort of immunity, or I mean, the population density could be less, therefore they have to find ways to present themselves to more mates. That's all very interesting.
I know this isn't necessarily along the lines of your research here, Dr. Ditchkoff, but Josh, what you just said sparked some thought in my head. Have you ever seen behavior from a deer that was either sick or survived something traumatic that they drastically changed their behavior in contrast to what their historical style behavior was?
No, and there's two problems with that. Is a lot of what we're doing is we're putting a radio collar on an animal and we're seeing what they're due by their locations. We're not there with them. The other problem with that is I sit at this computer way too much to see that stuff anymore. Now, and this is, so I ought to pause for a second and give credit, when you start mentioning these studies, like the 2017 study, it was funded by the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, the research that we did there. And the study was kind of led by a graduate student of mine, Jeff Sullivan, so he kind of, I said, hey, there's an idea we could do this. And he kind of carried that, and did it. And so there's a lot of really neat things out there that was a Jeff Sullivan paper. Yeah. And so, and you mentioned the testosterone paper, that was Monet Gomes, who I just had in my office. Before the podcast, we were meeting about some stuff she was doing. And, so all of this stuff is really, there's a small group of very special people that I'm surrounded by that really do a good job of making me look good, covering up my warts. So,
no, sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I think this stuff is really, really neat. And, coming back to, what Jacob, mentioned is these individuals are trying to figure out how to make sure their genetics are passed along. And that could happen in so many different ways. And I've speculated for a long time, and I don't have any data to really support this, but that they go into the breeding season, in theory, with an idea of who they want to breed with. If let's put this in human terms, if you had a 2-week window, if we as humans had a 2-week window when reproduction occurred, and it's prom night, you're going in and you're sitting here saying, okay, it's target number 1, target number 2, target number 3, whether you're a male or you're a female. We tend to think that males they will breed with whoever, but I think the males go in with these are priority females, these are secondary females. If a secondary female is available and it only takes me, 6 hours to do this, that's fine, but I'm still focused on, female number 1, female number 2, female number 3, and trying to figure out when they come into heat. I think the females are doing that. I think the males are doing that. As well. I don't think it's, as the second paper, that you discussed, that was Tristan Swartout, part of his master's thesis. They are not mating randomly. And if they're not mating randomly, then that supports the ideas that we kind of talked about a little earlier, that they are trying to be selective. And if they're being selective, we've got to give them enough credit that they at least know the 15 to 50 other individuals of the opposite sex to be able to say, that's my favorite and that's not. As a female, I want one. As a male, I want them all because the sperm contribution is cheap, but I can't spend the time to get them all. I can't put forth the effort. And so which ones do I target? If I'm a dominant male, I am going to identify those 2, 3, 7, and those are going to be my ones, particularly during the peak of the breeding season. I'm going to make sure that I am there for number 1 or number 2. But then on the outside, post-rut, pre-rut, as females come into heat, I will be looking. I will make myself available. I will take advantage of opportunistic encounters.
Yeah, it makes sense with scent. Josh, go ahead, actually.
No, I was just, I don't know if you were going to bring this up, Jacob. You might have had the same thought I just had. But Jacob and I have talked to, I believe we were having a discussion with Luke Reesop on the Whitetail Apprentice Series last season about bucks doing these excursions within their home range earlier than like the pre-rut and that. We've have both noticed this on multiple properties on over multiple years, where it seems like these bucks will come into an area, and what we are speculating is that they're checking on these different doe groups. There's a particular property in Ohio specifically where I will only get one of the mature bucks. I know they don't bed, or I'm not in their core area, but I know I'll see them during the rut, and this has happened year after year. But they'll come in around here. It's early August typically. They might be there for one night or two, and then they move on. And I don't see them at all until the last week of October into the first few days in November, when some of those does are coming into estrus. That has been very consistent over the few years. So we've discussed on the podcast the concept before of, bucks kind of checking these different doe groups within their home range, their full home range. And that kind of, I think that goes along with what you were just saying, where they're being selective.
I want to show you a example of this with actual trail camera data as well. Let's share a screen here.
See,
So
those bucks could be, they could be going in there and they could be checking females, but they're also advertising themselves.
Yeah. This is a deer that I chased in southwestern Wisconsin for a while in 2022. And so he visited this area and he never returned to it. And so I had other areas where this deer would visit and bed in doe bedding and check out does during August. It was usually this frame of late July, early August. And he kind of made a round all around this hub system, checking doe bedding. And so he comes through here. And then in the next time that he showed up in this camera, now he had showed up on every other camera throughout the rut in the same way that he did on this one. And every single time it was in relation to rut and does. This was the one camera that he didn't show back up to. And I went to pull this camera on December 14th. And he showed up, and I actually bumped him on the end of this ridge chasing does when I went to pull the camera. So he's continued back here. There's a doe getting chased by a younger deer. So it seemed like he came back during the second rut here and picked up the doe fawn. So the one place that I thought he didn't complete the loop, which kind of shot down my theory, he eventually went back and did so. And I have lots of examples of him even bedding. So he comes in here and he actually bedded down here on this day, 8/12. And then you go back to some of these occurrences he's with a doe here consistently during the rut, 11/16, 3 months later.
Jacob, your screen might have froze. I'm just seeing the one from July.
Let's do, let me represent here. It's going to do like a little bit of an infinite loop here for a second until I get you guys off my screen. Okay, let me get this up better. Sorry about that. So this is July. This is him on that point. And then he never showed back up until later on. He showed back up during the second rut and actually picked up a doe fawn that was being chased around by other bucks as well. And I kicked him up chasing this doe fawn right here when I went to pick up that camera. And so I watched him several different times. So if you look back on this, I watched him several different times visit bedding areas like this in August. And he's visiting this bedding area. And I had does on it before, does on it after, all the time. And then you go back to November and he's there again, back with the same does. Sometimes a doe would have like frostbite on their ears, or you could tell they lived in a group and the group broke up. But he went back with the same does that he checked out earlier in the season. And so I had just to come up with some term to just define this, not to create some term on it, but like I called it bird dogging. So we had this drill when I played football that was essentially, we called it bird dogging because I was a lineman, and you would take your route and you would step it one step, next step, next step. And we would basically rehearse our routes that we would go for our blocking scheme. And then we would repeat it in a game or repeat it in live drills. And it made it a lot easier to then execute on the plan we had just formed beforehand. And so have you seen anything in your research? I know it's very collar deer kind of oriented. But have you seen anything in your research that has shown that bucks will often trace their steps as somewhat of a practice before they go and pursue these doe groups, or where they try to gain information on does before they might come into heat?
It's hard to, we've seen things where we've seen deer retrace their steps. I can give you a couple of examples how, but it's also difficult to really document what you're asking, because we have a point location every 15 minutes or a point location every 30 minutes. And we might know that they were at the same location, but we don't know what that location necessarily represents and what animals were there, nor do we know how they got there. And so we really haven't looked at those use of those points in time. So I may look at point X, this particular location, and know that, okay, I had that deer there. Does that deer ever go back there? Well, they might have, but I located them here and I located them here, and I never actually documented. So I don't know if they went to that point or if they went around it. So that's some of the difficulties that we have with our current technology, which is great. It's amazing what we can do, but there are limitations. What we have documented is in our study in Oklahoma during that we did in McAllister, we had 2 different deer, and one of them in particular that we would see that would breed here and they would summer here. So one of them was 5 miles away, and we documented the animal taking this same path, this curving path, each year to and from over 3 years, their summer, range and their breeding range, 5 miles apart. And an individual that we trapped at the same day, the same site, we dropped the net on both of them. He had one that was about 2 miles away that we would see him make that same path to and from twice a year, to the breeding season or breeding range, from the breeding range, to the breeding range, from the breeding range. So we've seen them use these paths. We just haven't been able to look at it in the detail that you're asking about.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out that there's advantages and disadvantages to every style of study. I think a lot of people have seen guy Derek, for some reason his last name's escaping me, that does the drone research, the white-tailed deer research, is his YouTube page.
Yep.
I think that's really interesting because it's highly behavioral, but it's less continuous of a data set than, and people that might not know what the word continuous is in data might be screaming at their screen right now, but it's less continuous of a data set than a collared study, because while 322 hours is a very long time to be studying a specific deer, you are only capturing data when you are observing it. So I think that passive observation does a lot of justice to general trend over a larger population. You get a much larger data set. You get a lot more animals that you're surveying, a lot of different personalities, characteristics across different land types. Every kind of season there is, really. I think that's really, really valuable to understand where and when things are going on. And I think that maybe that drone analysis is where we can kind of dream up as hunters of the why and dream up some behavioral thing, because we can maybe see physically what they're doing a little bit differently. Like we can see that they, interacted with some deer or made a scrape or something like that. But I do think it each of them have their major successes, and each of them have some things that it's very difficult to grasp kind of within those. But I think they're both extremely valuable in certain ways. And I love that, again, we're not assigning any logic to something that we aren't certain of here. But I think that it's really great to see that we'll call it maybe hopscotching between different ranges across different times of year. And the fact that he's doing multiple visits per year when we know scent is their primary sense, I feel like it makes a lot of sense that they're conducting their own research essentially on what the doe herd's like, what survived last year, if that doe has fawns and she's going to kick those fawns out, things like that. And if I could, Rob, a little more time here, I wanted to touch on something you mentioned, the Swartout study. And I noticed a very interesting line in here to me. It says, theory postulates that positive assortative mating, a form of non-random mating, where individuals of closely similar phenotypes choose to mate with each other, which we've already talked about. Deer that will select for ones that have similar phenotypes. I think that this clarification, they say afterward, should occur in populations where variation in the quality of individuals exists, meaning that high quality individuals will select for mates with similar quality due to greater likelihood of survival of offspring to adulthood. I think it's interesting that you guys made or this study makes the point to point out that this is occurring specifically in populations where variation between the quality of individuals exists. So you might have a very diverse range of very healthy deer, less healthy deer, bigger deer, smaller deer, different testosterone levels maybe. Is there a reason that you guys made that qualification? Like, did you see maybe some things in the data that said, hey, we just surveyed a population that's all very young or all very old, and there is not very much selective mating?
Well, that's the second study that we published on the same sort of thing. We had a former student, Tim Newman, so we've got a deer research facility that we built in 2007. It's a 430-acre facility, and it's designed for these animals to kind of operate freely and have a normally functioning population within. So we have a unique opportunity to study these individuals with regards to who breeds with who. We have the ability to build a family tree.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're studying. We try and recapture all these individuals each year, which is easier said than done. Get updated blood blood collections, parasite counts, antler measurements, body size measurements. We have the tissue sample so we can determine the family tree and who's the mother and father of each offspring. But it provides us a unique opportunity to study a population over time and this breeding success for both the Swartout and the Newman papers. The original paper, Tim Newman studied this, the same question, do we have this positive assortative mating? And he found no. So I decided, when Tristan came on board, I said, we need to look at this again because our population has changed. When we first started in our facility in 2007, when we closed the fence, we started with what was in there. We believe we probably had a 3.5-year-old buck, but everything else was 2.5 and 1.5. So we did not have a mature population of males. The females, we would have more mature individuals. So it took 5 years for us to really start to get 5, 6, 7-year-old deer males in that population. And so I think Tristan's his study went through like 2022, his data, or 2020. So we had a mature population later in his study and an immature population, a younger population, earlier in his study. And that's why it was important that we clarified that. I also think it's important to kind of throw out there that we tend to fall into habits of assigning very human thought processes to how we describe deer. Mm-hmm. We say quality. Well, what is quality? Is quality size? Well, yeah, if I'm a deer hunter, quality size. But if I'm a marathon runner, quality isn't size, quality is endurance. If I'm looking at, is quality the number of offspring I successfully recruited? Is quality the genetic component, and the quality that I am to one female may be a different measure of quality to another female. And so I think that's where my group is. I try and be with my group very cautious in terms of how we describe these things and say, okay, we're taking a look at positive assortative mating with regards to phenotype, with regards to body size, with regards to antler size, and with regards to age. We could say those three things very factually, but what we don't know is how much of the genetics, how much of their parasite loads, what about their blood parameters, what about their personality, which has been brought up. There's hormones at play, which you've mentioned already. Is this 160-pound male that I can't remember which one of you referenced before that is, whipping up on these dominant males, or which one's the dominant? Is it the 160-pounder that's whipping up on the 200-pounder, or is it? There's a lot. I think we need to be very cautious as deer hunters when we falling into this pattern of saying, well, this means this. Well, it doesn't. We don't really know what it means to be a deer. We get these little snapshots from our game cameras. We get to spend, a couple hours, 100 hours in the woods if we're lucky during deer season. And we need to step back and say, gosh, I don't know what it's like to walk in that deer's shoes. I really don't know what it's like to be a deer. I don't know the constraints under which they operate. We don't know those things. And so it's really hard to really go back, and we're trying to piece this together with individual data points. We have an incredible data set at Auburn that nobody's ever had anything like this, to be able to look at the reproductive success of this animal and to be able to say, how does testosterone influence it? How does antler size influence it? How does we've looked at how the MHC influences it. We're working on getting that paper published right now. But gosh, it's just, they're little snapshots. We're trying to piece together this data set of 170 observations of matings, but there's so many factors that play a role that it's mind-numbing to come up with all the iterations that could possibly influence this. I mean, just anybody that listens to this podcast, just look around, and there's the husband and wife somewhere that you're like, I just don't get it.
Yeah.
And it's because we oversimplify. We don't know what he looks like in her eyes, or vice versa. And I think the same is true with deer.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Go ahead, Jacob.
I'm just going to say the next sentence that is below the ones I just read is, which I love that you just mentioned this, while the broad term quality is becoming more saturated in literature and undergoing scrutiny. And then you basically touch on, when we use quality in this study, you're specifically referring things that will produce a positive relationship with reproductive success. So you guys do a great job of defining, just if you ever do use the term quality in the study, that you are specifically using it for the purpose of the outcome of the study, which is great.
But listen, I appreciate that. Anytime you guys want to send us compliments, but especially publicly, just have at it. The reality is, we try and be cautious and good with what we do. But the reality is, and I don't remember, exactly what the reviews are, but when we publish these papers, we send them out and they're peer reviewed. So there's two or three scientists out there that are reading them and really poking holes in what we said. What we wrote in the first place. So it's very common that we're coming back and having to say, yeah, we really messed that up. We need to clarify what we're saying. And so while I would like to go with the fact that is what we wrote down the first time, but it is possible that there was somebody else came back and said, whoa, Ditchkoff, Swartout, Gomes, Newman, you back up, you need to
That's a very common thing too in all studies. And honestly, I wouldn't really want to have anyone on that doesn't have a peer-reviewed study too, because there's a very big difference between information and board-certified information when it comes to endocrinologists and stuff like that, or information and a study and a peer-reviewed study. They're very, very different things. So, but although I do invite and really enjoy speculation and personal opinion as well.
Speculation is part of it. Speculation is science, and you mentioned that I will say when I don't know. I try and be cautious about what I think is fact. And I will state it, very, very confidently, but also be honest about, I don't know the answer to that. I do it when I teach in class, and I'll do it here. And I think it's important, but I also think it's important that we speculate. I think that's the greatest thing that we can do as scientists, to sit there and say, boy, I think that's possible. And, the greatest, medical advancements and, just the things that have put us, today, the internet, all of these things, that are making life today what it is it's creative individuals with speculation and exploring those things. We do it with deer. There's other individuals doing it in other areas that are just super creative, medically, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I wanted to stay on this study. We'll eventually circle back to the other one because there's some other topics I want to hit on, that one from 2017. But since we're on this recent one, can you go over some of the results as far as what you guys discovered in that study when it came to those phenotypic characteristics you were looking at?
I think there's a lot of detail that, anybody can access these studies by going to our website. You can Google Auburn University Deer Lab, and you can go to our list of publications, and there's a copy of it on there so you can read it. It's kind of mind-numbing if you're not used to reading these, kind of wading through the results. Yep. And there were a lot of results presented in there. I think the biggest thing is, to me, the take-home message is coming from this is there is a tendency. It's not a guarantee. There is no black and white in biology. It's one big gray area. It's a continuum. But those that have greater body size tend to breed with conspecifics that have greater body size. Larger males tend to breed with larger females. Smaller females tend to breed with smaller males. Younger males tend to breed with younger females, et cetera, et cetera. That's the general trend. You referenced before, it kind of falls apart when you don't have the variation in there on this. And so, but it's important, I believe, to recognize that we find this trend, but it's important to recognize that there are other factors that are influencing the attractiveness of females to males and males to females. As a female, yes, I want the one with the largest antlers because my offspring will probably have larger antlers, which means that they might be more successful. I want the larger individual because that's a measure of his ability to acquire resources, to be dominant, and so I want my male offspring to have that. But at the same time, that big dominant male does not have genetics that complement my MHC for my offspring to have a good, strong immune system. So that has to factor in.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the point is I want that male, but that male is with another doe right now. Do I wait and recycle 28 days later, hoping that he's around? Now I have a late-born offspring. There's so many factors at play here, and I alluded to it before. You're going to the prom. Who do you want to invite to the prom? Well, I want to invite her, but boy, if I do that, then this or this. Should I wait? What do I do here? There's a lot of factors at play here, and I think we just need to remember that. But then it becomes interesting to say, how does that influence how that animal moves? Which is really what we're interested in as a hunter. It's neat to talk about in March, July, September, what these deer are doing from a breeding perspective. But when you're sitting out there in a stand or figuring out where you're going to go, the only thing you care about at that point is where is that deer going to be? And that's what where this starts to factor in is, are they going to be active? Are they not going to be active? And when are they going to be active?
Yeah.
And that's the part where this kind of comes back to, and it's hard to translate that, but I think it's, the two papers you picked, I think kind of demonstrate both sides of that, where, the Swartout paper that we were just talking about is, and the Newman paper before it is, which ones actually come together and breed, or more importantly, which ones come together and actually sire an offspring and it's successfully recruited to make 6 months of age, versus the Sullivan paper and from 2017 is, what are these females actually doing at this time of the year? Which influences what those males are doing.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted. That's the point I wanted to circle back to with that 2017 paper, because there's we didn't quite get into some of the, because you guys looked at movement rates, home range size, core area size, and we didn't quite get into some of those results in relation to conception. So could we kind of go over into that as far as what these does were actually doing in that time frame?
I think the biggest thing is these females are advertising themselves as these in the days. So we studied and don't virtually slap me if I don't remember the exact numbers here. But I think we were looking at this over a 40-day period, if I remember, kind of number of days, several weeks leading up to the date of conception and several weeks after. Yeah. And what we were finding was activity, home range size, and all of these things were going up and up and up, and then really peaking right around the date of conception or the days leading up to it. So their activity levels is going up, their home range size is going up, or maybe we were looking at core area size. I don't remember which one it was, but their probability of going on an excursion, or in other words, what we also call an extra home range movement. They are going outside their normal area of travel and going someplace that is, it may not be unique to them, but it's not in their normal daily travels. They're going to, for some reason, they're going to the next town over, walking around for a couple hours or a couple days, and then coming back. And so, yes, and so you see that. And so we were taking a look at it 40 days before and 40 days after. And you take a look at it, it's got date of conception is 0. You see a peak right before that 0, before the date of conception, where they are advertising as much as they can, and then they're coming back down. But we also see a peak after. And so that is movement rate, I think, is what you're looking at. I can't see it quite right there. But then what we're seeing is we're seeing a drop off, but then about 20 days or 18 days post, we're seeing another increase where what we speculate what's happening is these females don't necessarily know they're pregnant yet. They are pregnant, they have conceived, but the hormone levels have not adjusted enough for them to realize they're pregnant. And so they're saying, okay, my body's telling me I better do this. And all of a sudden, oh, okay, I'm already pregnant. I can back off now. I've already, and so we're seeing that peak just before conception in terms of the rate of movement, the home range size, the probability of excursions. And we attribute that to these females saying, my best chance of getting the best genetics is to advertise to as many males as possible, or to go out there and try and find the right male, just to make sure that I'm passing on the best genetics. He may be right here close to me, but he might be in the next town over.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I feel so validated right now that you just mentioned that and looking at this study, because I mean, if we're hunters and we're looking at this strategically, right? How can we use these results from the study to employ it in our strategy? For one, keeping tabs on does, not maybe as much as bucks, but certainly much more than the average hunter already does, I think is really important. One of the things that I've used is and I've shown this in many videos, is when doe groups break apart, or when a doe starts to move more and further from her typical range, or you see new does coming in to areas that they aren't typically at, it tells me that something's about to happen, like something's about to heat up. And I often see that in like the pre-rut, is that this movement rate starts to increase, just like we're seeing here, days to conception 0. So you see it start to taper off. And I really think what might be happening down here is that quote unquote lockdown, if I'm going to assign some human reasoning to it, is that doe is probably moving just slightly less because she's honed in on where and what she's going to mate with. But you see this home range start to increase as well. And I just think that the home range and core area, I think that's so interesting. And I think that we can use that as hunters to see that, all right, this doe group is habitually in this area. I noticed that they had a bunch of fawns. The fawns just got kicked out. Or I noticed that she is spending a long time out of this area and returning, and she's on the move, or things are chasing her, stuff like that. I think it's just as important for us to account for, how much is that doe traveling versus how much is the buck you're after traveling. And that might signal to you that this doe might be the one, as well as, we talked about deer with larger, buck with larger size may want to breed with a doe of larger size, or a doe of larger size will likely want to select a buck with larger antlers. And she may get that choice because she is larger, of maybe a higher quality. We can't predict the genetics just looking at the deer. But in thinking back to successful hunts I've had during the rut, a lot of times it's been a large matriarch doe that was with the buck I wanted to, and she had just got squirrely and kicked out her fawns, and her range was varying like crazy, and now she's returned with that buck. And that's when success happens.
Well, I think it's important to remember is so this curve here on the left, this days to conception, is if that represents the movement pattern of an individual doe, and let's just assume that that's the average movement pattern, and that each individual doe has a pattern similar to that. If we just make that assumption for a second, then now if you overlaid all those individual does, we have to keep in mind that they're not all conceiving on the same day. You have some that are coming into heat early in the season, some late, while the majority are are at the peak of the breeding season. So you have that normal distribution of individuals coming into heat. So now you have all these individual does exhibiting this pattern over a time frame of, if you're up in Wisconsin, over about a 2 to 3 week period. If you're here in Alabama, it might be a 4 to 6 week period. And then you start to factor in, okay, that's what the does are doing. Now, how are the bucks responding to these does and all of their individual patterns and when they're moving and how they're moving? It just becomes, it's difficult to wrap your mind around it.
Yeah.
Question on this with the movement rates. So last season on the Whitetail Apprentice Series, it was episode 214. We sat down with Luke Resop, and the episode's titled "Breaking Down Buck Movement During the Rut," and we looked at buck movement rates through all phases of the rut. And in the later part of the rut, we see kind of a similar increase in movement here that we're seeing to these does, as far as that 2 week late rut phase. Their movement rates were much higher. So have you guys taken a look at and kind of compared and contrast as like how that interaction may be if the doe movement rate is higher as well as the buck movement rate is higher?
No, and so what we do see, and we've taken a look at movement rates, and we do see an increase in I don't know, I haven't looked at movement rates per se relative to the rut, or we have it, but we haven't really interpreted it in the same way that you're asking about. But I've always kind of envisioned it in being this way. There's been a lot of discussion in Alabama because we really didn't hunt the post-rut here in Alabama for a lot of years until we changed the season. And that didn't happen until like the early teens, 2012-ish, 2014, right in there somewhere, where we extended our season to February 10th. And it used to end at the end of January, despite the fact that our peak of breeding was around January 20th. So we had the end of our breeding season. We couldn't even hunt. And so there's always been a lot of speculation as far as what these animals are doing, because most people would tell you, boy, the best time to kill a buck was at the end of January. The hunting was just getting good. And I don't believe it's necessarily that there's more movement of these bucks. I believe it's less availability of does. That they're unable to find a doe to breed with. And I think the younger bucks are still all moving throughout this, but your bigger bucks is like, okay, as every day goes past, there's more and more does that are bred. And so the availability of the resource of interest to me, an unbred doe, is decreasing dramatically. My testosterone levels are high. I've got a short window to be able to get this breeding done, and I have a very limited resource. Now I really need to go on the hunt. And there's no receptive doe to hold my attention. So now, as a hunter or as a game camera, I'm catching pictures of that. I'm seeing it as a hunter, or I'm snapping more pictures of these bucks. That's not necessarily greater movement. That might be more active. That might just be more visible. So, I've always said that the peak of the breeding season is the worst time to hunt, because your bucks are actually moving less. There's more of them locked on does, and your dominant bucks should dang sure be locked on a doe. But as the days go on past that, any mature bucks that are remaining that have not been harvested, their activity levels should be activity levels. I just fell in the same trap. It's not necessarily their activity levels, but their visibility should increase, because their probability of being locked on a doe is going down. So my chances of seeing them as a hunter are going up.
Yeah. In that podcast with Luke, I know Jacob and I had discussed, like, around here in Ohio, there's always seems to be an uptick in harvests of mature bucks around Thanksgiving around here, which would be like what you're discussing here, as far as there are less receptive does, or more does have been bred, therefore like the visibility of these bucks is increasing. And I feel like we see that, online, we see guys posting pictures of big bucks around Thanksgiving around here all the time. And then the peak rut, I want to say peak conception date is like November 7th for this area. So
yeah, and that doesn't surprise me. Plus, you have more hunters in the woods. People are able to get away around Thanksgiving, so that's also going to factor in a little bit too. But it's a common belief here in Alabama, and I'm sure it is most places. When you get later in the season, the hunting actually gets better. But there are a lot of good deer have already been harvested too.
Have you looked into how habitat may play a factor into this, as far as like areas that are very diverse and have a very just a good habitat to support a very healthy deer herd, versus areas that may not have a lot of diversity, maybe like more of a monoculture.
We haven't. Our studies, most of our studies, not all, but most of them are for a specific area.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're working on, if that's a state funding some research, whoever's funding it, we're normally working on a specific piece of property, and we don't have the ability to evaluate across different gradients of density or habitat or anything like that. It's just one population.
I got you. Because when I was reading over this research, I couldn't help but think about different areas that I hunt and how this might play into my strategy and stuff. And I've said that on this podcast before. Reading all the research and stuff has really taken me down more so the habitat diversity path, as far as finding higher quality bucks in that, or healthier doe or deer herds in general. And then in these areas, I typically find a better age structure, because bucks have the ability to hide from hunters and escape from hunters. So when I take a look, when I was reading these studies, and you guys had hit on age structure, a young age population versus an older age structure, it was just sparking some thoughts in my head of these different areas that I hunt, where I typically find an older age structure of deer.
Yeah, it's hard to speculate. I could throw a lot of theories out at you, but I don't know, man.
Are there any theories that you are very interested in pursuing, as far as from a research aspect?
I mean, if you just talked about habitat, and what you just mentioned, it's, there's pretty good evidence out there that dominant individuals, at least when we're looking at females, dominant females have the ability to establish home ranges in the best habitat, in the best area. So if I'm going to try and find, and if I go back to some things I said before, if a dominant male, if she's a good quality female, in theory, then your good quality males are going to try and breed with her. So in theory, they're going to try and be utilizing the same range that she is, at least during the breeding season. If you have variation in the quality of a habitat across an area that you're able to hunt, I'm going to be trying to go into those better quality areas, which I think we tend to do as hunters anyways. Mm-hmm. We're looking at food sources and food availability, that sort of thing. I think it'd be interesting to study that. I don't know how I would do it. It'd be a Herculean effort in the amount of resources that would be needed to be able to answer those questions. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, I'd imagine it'd be very difficult, because you need a large enough area to ensure that you have the habitat, or just the differences in habitat, and let alone you have to get enough deer for the data to actually mean something. Yeah, it would be a Herculean effort.
But I can think it's a podcast hosts that could fund something like that. And listen, I know some places we could do it.
I'll talk to Jacob and Andrew. They have more funds than we do.
Yeah, you should talk to them.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, as far as application goes, because every time we do one of these, we want to make sure that we're giving the listeners points that they can take away from this podcast and actually utilize in some aspect in their hunting strategy. So, Dr. Ditchkoff, if you were to, you've been involved in this research for quite some time. So if you were looking at this data, how would you apply this to your hunting strategy?
I think there's a couple levels of thoughts that I would have to share. And number one is, first I would sit there and say, don't ruin the pure joy of it, of going out there and just hunting and being a part of that. And part of the fun is trying to figure this out. And you guys are, a couple of deer geeks, Jacob more than any, because he knows the white t-shirt studies. And so I know that's a big part of this, and that's what makes this fun. But I remember sitting with Carl Miller who's at University of Georgia, retired a couple of years ago, super smart guy, well known in the deer world. And we were talking one day, and it's like, my goodness, we're taking some of the fun out of this. Just the fact that I can go out there and sit and take the pressure off. Number one, it's don't ruin it by making it too hard. Don't overthink it. Take advantage of the opportunities to hunt when you have them, because sometimes, the reality is the regular deer hunt only has a couple days to go out and hunt anyways. Just go out there, enjoy it, do the best you can, but don't worry about it too much. Number two, I would sit here and don't fall into the trap of thinking about these deer as being robots. The deer A operates the same as B operates, C or D. In some ways, I think it's important to think about humans and to say, how different are you from your brother or your sister or your father or your son? Even those that are most similar to you, how different are you? There's a lot of dissimilarity amongst all those individual deer. And I can show you a line on a graph. We've done that in this podcast. But that line is not representative of any individual. That's just the average. And so don't get caught up with the average. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of departures from that. As I said, there's no black and white out there. It's all one gray area. It's all, just a continuum of spectrum of possibilities with regards to behavior. So there's a lot of differences out there, number one. Don't think of them as robots. Think like a human, the differences we have. But also don't fall into the trap of thinking of them like humans. They are deer. And deer are different than humans, and we don't know what it's like to walk in their shoes. We don't know what pressures they're under that drive them to do the things that they do. I'm teaching a nutrition class right now, and I say we have to remember the fact that deer live on the edge of undernutrition. They don't have a pantry, they don't have a refrigerator, they don't have DoorDash. They don't have any of those things, but they are constantly battling just to get by nutritionally, so that they have the resources to provide the milk that their offspring need. So they have the resources to be able to put forth the energy, the effort that's needed to get, to acquire a mate. And so look around you and see what it's like, how different humans are, and you can apply that to deer, but don't think that deer are like humans in terms of the decisions that they make, and then that's what I try and do. It's like, boy, that's not a human. It's a deer. It's operating differently, different pressures, different constraints, but understand that they're all different, the same as we're all different.
Yeah. Those are very good points. It's very easy to give deer human traits and like a human thought process. And then I feel like it can easily create confusion. You can get lost in the weeds. I know when I was first trying to learn a bunch of stuff, I was like, there's a lot here, and you can easily walk yourself in circles and get confused. And I find when I do the best out in the deer woods, it's when I try and keep things simple.
Yeah.
Right. And then
you've thrown out a lot of names, since, I know you've done podcasts with Will Goldsby and Mark Turner, and, you mentioned Craig Harper, and there's other names. These are all super smart guys that have such great information to share. And next week's podcast and last week's podcast, you've got individuals that are providing really unique information in their own areas of expertise. Mm-hmm. But we all have a tendency to say, this is what we see. But I think we all have to be careful of not falling into that trap that this defines the possibilities of what I see out there. We're describing to you the average, the norm, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that really describes what those deer do out there. And I think that's what makes it neat when we go out there, is we're going to see something unique and different every day.
Yeah. I know before we started this podcast, I was talking to you about, what I do, working in outpatient orthopedics. And I'm a clinical instructor, so I get a few students each year. And I always tell my students, my job is to not necessarily teach you all this information. That's your school's job. But my job is to help you kind of untangle the mess, all the information that you've been getting over the years, and figure out how to put it in a clinical application. And I always go back with my students, because they'll get lost in the weeds on, like, this clinical practice guideline says this is the best way to treat this diagnosis and all this. I'm like, true. I was like, but look at the person in front of you, and try not to don't oversimplify it. Don't make it too complex. Look at what's presented right in front of you.
Take it at face value.
Take it at face value, and then apply what you know to that individual.
Yeah, it's, we all heal differently. I go in for a arthroscopic knee surgery, but you're going to be up and walking in 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
Person X is walking in a day. Person Y, it takes them really 2.5 weeks. They're still limping. There's just, everything's a little bit different.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Jacob, were there any other topics on this you would like to discuss as far as breeding behavior goes?
One thing I noticed in one of the studies, just kind of as a side thought, is that it seems like the female, like if you looked at the age classes of females over the years of this study, you see like the larger, it makes sense that the deer 1 year will go into the next bucket of 1 year older category and 1 year older category. But it looked like that females were surviving to maturity more often than males, those making it longer than bucks, which makes a lot of sense, especially considering what hunters like to kill and stuff like that. But it also would make sense that often the situation is that there's maybe a higher density of does or higher density of does of maturity and maybe a lower density of bucks of maturity than there would be of does on if you were to, again, take the average. So I think it reinforces that it's important that we consider what the does are doing, because if there are plenty of does available or more does available of a mature class, or ones that certainly are well practiced at living and perpetuating, their bloodline, then it would make sense that the males would have to do a lot of the legwork, or the females would have to do a lot of the legwork to find the minority of males that are available of that age class.
That's a good point. I never really thought about it from that perspective. You're correct in the fact that a 1-to-1 sex ratio out there doesn't exist. Males just die at a higher rate. We see it in humans. We see it in every other species that's out there. When the males are the ones compete, is the sex that's competing for the females, they are putting themselves at risk during that window and living a very, very hard life. So you do have an unbalanced sex ratio normally, and by default, as you just referenced, you do have somewhat of an unbalanced age structure. I've never really thought about it from the perspective that if you've got an equal amount of choosiness between males and females, that female needs to work harder. She's got more competition for the best possible male, and how does she overcome that? And it's a really creative thought that I need to chew on a little bit. I think it's a neat thought that I hadn't considered, but it has to factor in. But I think but everything that we've talked about, at least with the data that we found, support the idea that they're having to work.
Mm-hmm.
They're having to work to find the best possible mate.
Yep.
And that influences hunting.
Yeah, there's so much stress in them too. I mean, you watch, if everyone's been in the stand last or first doe in heat, maybe not everyone's seen this, but like that doe is getting dogged, right? So she's got to do work. I see does choose really off the wall places. Like a lot of times their home range is in a very secure area. A lot of deer frequent the area. And so a lot of deer have access to the area. And oftentimes when they do that excursion, as your data shows, they do the excursion before the date that they might be bred. I often see them go to, in swamps, it's really common for them to go to tamarack root balls. So they go off of like the mainland, like Oak Islands or mainlands around ag and stuff where all the deer congregate, their typical year-round range, and they will go to an isolated root ball that can literally only fit 2 deer, and there's water and loud brush and cattails, and they can hear anything coming, and they have to like work to isolate themselves in a way that, because we're dealing with a good maturity, a good density of mature bucks, they can allow the one specific buck to find them, or they could go choose that root ball that the one specific buck has been isolating himself on. And I often find that the females that just get tortured are the ones that are around the vast population of deer. And so, she might have to do work to get away from other deer, or sometimes we see does kick their fawns out or get aggressive towards other does where they're like, no, this is my area now. Like, I need to do this so I can retain this male, because there's not many, and this is my chance at having my my bloodline live. And again, assigning human emotions and thought processes to this, but it seems to be backed with the data in both the density of mature bucks on land versus mature does. And it seems to also be encouraged by the data showing that females are much more likely to go on an excursion right before their date of breeding.
Yeah, I've seen what you're describing multiple times inside of high fences. In those scenarios, you really have artificial age structures, artificial densities, and artificial sex ratios. Frequently a 2 buck to 1 doe sex ratio, tons of mature bucks. Those poor females, when they come into heat, they may have 10 or 12 males going around them like satellites. It's just absolute harassment. I've seen them jump in running from, I've seen 10 plus bucks chasing an individual doe. Obviously she's in heat. She just runs into a pond and swims across. I've seen them isolate themselves on islands. Those are extreme scenarios that we don't see on free range, but yeah, it has to be happening. Exactly what you're describing. The harassment that they undergo during that 24, 48-hour window, it has to be tremendous.
I caught a yearling fawn last year that had gone into heat, had been just old enough to slip into heat. And November 29th, which is really, really late for the area I am in Wisconsin in terms of like rut activity, that would be approaching the second rut. And this fawn had basically missed when most does come into heat first and foremost, and then kind of sat awkwardly between, like just reached the maturity to be able to be bred before the does would hit that 28-day recycle. And so she was like one of the only. She wasn't like the last doe. She was like the only doe at this time that was really in heat per what I'd seen. And I found a buck just dogging her, figure eighting her, and I shot him, and I had 4 other bucks come by like just after that to try and get after her. But I'm pretty sure after I shot that buck, she turned around and thanked me. Like she hopped a creek, and I shot him right before he hopped the creek after, and she turned and looked at me and walked. Like she was like, oh, he's gone. Like now I can catch my breath. But like it's kind of amazing though, because you can't come up, you simply don't have access to the data as a hunter. You can't come up with these things and observe and learn these things if you aren't open-minded. If you are so stuck on this thing you heard from someone or you succeeded one time doing or 10 times doing, you're never going to open your mind up to learn the other things. And you really have to just release your biases and be able to take at face value what's coming in. And I love talking to people like you because it puts a little bit more credence to the observation, and I can sit back and say, all right, this does work, to sit back and not assign any bias to this. And the proof might not be in front of me, but it will come. I just need to think about this in a detailed and unbiased way. And that has helped me more than anything.
I mean, I think everything you've said is correct. And I think there's one other thing that that we all need to accept and I think embrace is there's a whole lot of luck goes into this.
Oh yeah.
There's a whole lot of luck. And I'm not if I get a good deer, it's not because I'm a good deer hunter. I'm a lucky deer hunter. But it's great to talk about. I think there's a lot of things at play that people don't consider. And it's like I said, it's neat to talk about, but at the end of the day, you've got to go out there and put yourself in the right place at the right time. And I don't put enough effort into it from a hunting perspective to really consider myself a good hunter or put myself in the right place at the right time with any consistency. So I just need to be lucky. But you guys obviously, at least Jacob, he's got cameras all over the Midwest, it looks like. And spend a lot of time looking at it. You're going to make a woman real unhappy one day.
He just got married.
Oh, well, I did see that. So maybe you've already started.
I put her first. She's actually picking up deer hunting with me this year and getting into it when she gets home today.
Her first. It sounds like you've dragged her into your, that you have.
I definitely could have done that. I definitely could have dragged her, but I've been very fortunate to have good and bad examples of people that have done that. And I started my involvement in the hunting community with Dan Infalt. And so I started filming with him. I don't know if you're familiar with who he is, but the first time we ever met, he was interviewing me about a deer I'd killed in the story. And we just talked for like 2-3 hours afterward. And I just asked him, I just felt really compelled to ask him this. I was like, what's your biggest regret in hunting? And this is a guy that hunts 30, 40 days a year, like hunts almost every day of the season, and kills almost every year a really nice deer, on public land. And he said, your kids are never going to remember those deer you shot, but they're certainly going to remember if you were there for them. And that hit me really deep. And he said, I love that I get to do the things I can do. And I'm blessed that my family stuck around, with me throughout all this. But if I could go back and change anything, it would be, if it would be the right move to change it, he said, I would go back and make sure I treated my family with a little more attentiveness as I did my hunting. And I am so thankful for him and that example, and so many guys that perpetuate that example within the community nowadays. I tell my wife, Caitlin, like all the time, that she is my first and foremost priority, and I'm going to advocate for my passion. And if she wants to be a part of it, she can. I'm not going to push her in any direction because that'll just push her away. But I'm very, very blessed to have a girl that no matter what supports my passions, but even luckier so that she wants to take part in it now.
Yeah, that's special.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see how she does this season.
Me too. She's going to kill something bigger than me. I've accepted it at this point. Like,
I can't wait for that to happen.
Yeah. And you already know me, Josh. I'll be more excited for her than if I killed it myself. So.
Yes. You're going to call us shaking in your voice. You're like, she got one.
She got splits.
Yeah, it'll be an awesome experience.
Right.
But with that, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Dr. Ditchkoff, thank you very much for your time. I know we're rolling, I think, well over an hour here, so I greatly appreciate you hopping on today. But with that, this has been the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and this is the Whitetail Apprentice Series. I am your host, Josh Luck, joined by my co-host, Jacob Sklenar, and today our guest was Dr. Steve Ditchkoff. Everyone, have a good one.